Good afternoon, and likely good morning to some. On behalf of the National Bar Association President, uh, CK Hoffler, the NBA COVID 19 Task Force, and the NBA Health Law section, we'd like to welcome you to our second installment of the NBA COVID 19 Redefining Wellness Seminar Series. My name is Sharice Frazier, and I am the chair of the NBA Health Law section, and I'm delighted to be the moderator for this afternoon. I'm also excited to be here with Dr. Nicole Lamar, who will share her expertise and insight and tips to redefining wellness during these challenging times. Dr. Lamar studied at the Illinois School of Professional Psychology in Chicago, where she earned a master's and a doctorate in clinical psychology. Much of her clinical training and professional work has been among ethnically and socioeconomically diverse populations for both adolescents and adults. She handles diagnosis ranging from severe mental illness to everyday difficulties in relationships and stress management. She has more than 17 years of psychological clinical expertise and have experience in a variety of clinical settings. Dr. Lamar has held adjunct professional roles at Chicago's Harold Washington College and DC's University of DC. She currently has a private practice in Washington, DC. So, as I mentioned before, I'm extremely excited to be with her today and to learn all the ways we can get better during these challenging times. Now, if you have questions, we will have two opportunities during the webinar for questions. So about midway, we'll stop. Please enter any questions in the chat function and we'll take a look at those and have Dr. Lamar answer them. We'll also have question times at the end. So we appreciate your attendance and hope that you will learn some great tips to bettering your wellness during these challenging times.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I am happy to be here and discuss a little bit about, wellness overall with specific focal points to a smidget of depression, but mostly anxiety. And I'll tell you why the focal point is more about anxiety than anything else. It certainly begins with that of COVID, right? And these times that we find ourselves in. So I'm happy to be here. Just a few housekeeping notes, all participants are muted throughout the presentation. Um, as Sharice mentioned, if you have questions, please feel free to post them at any time. And, we hope to address them at two different points within the presentation. And there is technical support if you should need it. So wellness, amidst all things uncertain, right? I certainly believe and live by the premise that, everything is relatively uncertain. We as human beings, we operate via patterns. And so we don't really know what tomorrow will bring, what today will bring. We don't have, any real idea. And I don't say that to, elevate our fears and our anxieties anymore. I say that because it's really, our actuality. We like to believe, we like to hope, we like to have faith, that we'll wake tomorrow, that our days will come, that we'll raise our families, that we'll work, that we'll do what we do. But we have such hope and faith, mostly because that's the way it's been. And so I like to use that premise to sort of help us remember that things are always relatively uncertain, but yet, we find a way to adapt. And so, COVID and certainly the year 2020 has made that ever so clear to us. I certainly think that COVID has added a different dimension to our, would-be fears and levels of uncertainty already. because, it is something that is unprecedented, certainly for our lifetime. And so with that, I have certainly seen a significant number of anxiety difficulties increase in patients that I've seen for years already, but certainly in persons that I've been seeing newly. So anxiety disorders are the most common mental illness in the US. They develop in a variety or for a variety of different ways, So there is a genetic component to anxiety disorders. There's a brain chemistry, there's a personality aspect, there are cognitive aspects that could make anxiety in general, a little bit more prevalent or likely to happen. But as we go, I'll talk to you about the difference and the distinctions between anxiety disorders and anxiety, right? Anxiety in and of itself is common to all of us. We all come with anxiety because we need it. So it's not uncommon for someone with an anxiety disorder to also suffer from depression or vice versa. And mood disorders, all things depression. There are a number of depressive disorders that fall under depression in general, but major depressive disorder is, the most commonly diagnosed in the US, and the leading, disability in the US for sure. But don't be dismayed again by the term disorder, versus the sadness and anxiety that everyone, and I mean everyone, has felt, and will feel. So, again, sadness versus depression, depressive disorders, and anxiety versus anxiety disorders. There's a clear distinction to be made. So our primary wellness factor, or focal point today will be anxiety. And so what we'll do is we'll define anxiety and make some very clear distinctions about what it is and what it isn't. And we'll recognize and talk about ways to determine when and how our anxiety may manifest within us or within others. And then we'll talk about ways in which to reduce or resolve our anxiety so that it does not manage us. So what is anxiety? It's really a feeling, most similar to other feelings, right? It's a feeling like, joy, happiness, anger, frustration, disappointment, etc. But it is a feeling of unease, of worry, of nervousness. And so feelings are a number of things. They are important, they are relevant, they are useful, and we all have them. And so despite, what many people might think about their own experience with their feelings based upon their upbringing or how we're socialized as humans, we all have feelings. They're built in us. We come with them. How they manifest, how we process them, how we accept them, how we deal with them, how we manage them, that varies, but the existence of them within us is a part of all of us. Feelings are not facts, right? They don't necessarily denote something factual. And that's an important distinction to make because we sometimes feel so impassioned about something that we feel like it's a fact. So, if I feel, a sense of jealousy, that's not to say that, that is a factual feeling and is connected contextually to what caused, that feeling. That feeling could change. In fact, feelings often do. And so again, they are important and they should always be recognized, but they should not be entertained as fact. and they shouldn't necessarily be deemed as, global, that I feel this way, and so therefore everybody does or should. Why is anxiety so common? It's common because, again, we're pre-built to have a sense of anxiety. It's in us to warn us. It's a signal, and so we need it. We need to know if there is trouble lurking, um, and and so we should use our anxieties as such, as a signal. Um, the other aspect that is essential when understanding our anxiety is the importance of perception. And so, what I perceive as important or urgent or imminent, versus what you perceive as important, urgent or imminent, could vary. And we need to understand that and make that distinction when we're processing our own anxieties. So, if you've ever, had someone call you and leave you a message and say it's urgent, that you get back to me. I have to get some information from you. Well, it could be urgent from their perception, but not necessarily from yours. And so how you manage that is, varied between the dynamics within your relationships. But it's just a vital, distinguishable fact to make note of. It's also important as we process our own anxieties and our own concerns and worries and fears. Um, Given COVID, given the realism of COVID, that COVID, is actually life or death. It is a big deal, right? That is why, I think anxieties have been much higher, this year, in persons, because of its real imminent threat. And so with that being said, we still have to balance, the levels of anxieties that we fear, because what anxiety could be, usually is irrational, right? And so it's an important part of anxiety. Our anxieties flood us and they make us feel like all things are actually imminent when they may not necessarily be. So I've certainly talked to people, all year, about their practices with COVID, their comfort levels with COVID, and certainly everybody is at a different place, as they would be, because people live all over the world and they have different experiences in their face versus, in what is happening for their neighbor, or family members in other parts of the city, country, or world. And so, it's important to constantly assess where I am, and what my fears and concerns and decisions and judgments are based upon, and why, and not necessarily merge all things or blur everything with, what the news, says, and what my neighbors are saying. And so, we do that with our own, again, sense of intellect, and our own sense of balance within our anxieties. And so I've had a lot of people have a hard time with balancing, the distinction between important, urgent, and imminent. And so it's our own personal work to do, because we're the ones who feel it in our own bodies. But everything isn't imminent. It just isn't, and it can't be. It's exhausting enough when things are imminent, but all things aren't. And we need to constantly remember that so that we can work to remain in balance. Anxiety is not all in your head. It isn't necessarily rational. It isn't an occasional worry. It isn't, nor should it be, ignored. It isn't something that, any of us should be ashamed of. And it is not unmanageable. And so that is an important point to me, because I certainly perceive it as something that is manageable. And I, like everybody in the world, has experienced, points of immense anxiety. But all of my days aren't like that. And, I think a lot of effort and work to manage anxieties, have proven to be effective. And we'll certainly talk about that as we go. Again, the distinction between disorders and anxiety is one that is an important one to sort of make. So, generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, specific phobias, OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder, panic disorder, PTSD or post traumatic stress disorder. These are all disorders under the anxiety domain. And so everybody does not experience anxiety to the level of a disorder, um, which is great, right? And so these numbers sort of represent, the prevalence of these disorders within the U.S. And so what makes the difference between an anxiety disorder and just sort of stress and anxiety that we all endure? The primary distinguishable factor is functioning. So how does your anxiety, your stress impact your functioning? And so are you able to, work and take care of your children? Are you able to leave your home? Does your anxiety stifle your social activities, your social interaction? Does your obsessive compulsive disorder limit your welcoming of people, into your life for fear that germs or other obsessive thoughts, will sort of take over? These are very important distinctions to make. We certainly live in a less stigmatized world with regard to mental illness, which I think is fantastic. And so we certainly hear people, use the terminology of OCD or PTSD or my ADD or ADHD, attention deficit. We hear people use this terminology very loosely. And so, I think in part that can help with some of the destigmatization of mental illness. But, I think it's important that we remember that these are real disorders and they affect people significantly. And so, again, if we're talking about disorders, there's a different level of support or care often that is needed. But no different than if we had a stomach ache. The distinction between a stomach ache, because of something I ate, versus an ulcer is distinguishable, as it should be, right? And so for me, it has very little to do with the label in and of itself, but more to do with what do we do about it? I should not respond in the same way, right, to a stomach ache based upon something that I ate, as I would if I had an ulcer. I should not respond or treat, my heart fluttering or heart palpitations due to, fear, as I would a heart attack. So the distinction is important. Stress affects everyone. We use the words of stress and anxiety sort of interchangeably, which can be fine. But the premise of anxiety affecting everyone is something that I think we should always keep in mind, and it's an important one because I want everybody to know that it isn't uncommon and it's actually expected. If someone is chasing you, if your family is in imminent danger, I would expect, you to be anxious. I would expect for you to have some sort of reaction. And if you didn't, that would actually be of greater concern. So if there are questions at this point, I'm happy to address them, as best I can, or if not, we can certainly continue on, but you tell me.
So one question, Dr. Lamar, is that when you're trying to determine what is the everyday worry versus something that has risen to the level of anxiety, what are some ways that an individual can differentiate between the two?
Sure. So the length of the worry, right? How rational the worry is, um, and so I know that that is perhaps, a loose response, but it really is more individual. Um, one of my clients actually lives and works in Africa, and it's temporary, but she's been there for about a year. And so some of her daily worries, are about her safety, and are about, sort of weather cyclones, right? And so I don't share those daily worries and concerns, but that doesn't mean that hers are irrational. Um, a better gauge of whether your fears or your worries are irrational is, again, based upon how you can function within those daily fears or worries. So, for example, if I have fears of my children, um, being harmed, in the streets, um, how do I manage those worries and fears? What are my actions? What are my plans? If my action and my response to that is to keep them home indefinitely, not send them to school, not let them go out and play with friends. And I suggest as a result that their friends can only visit us inside of the house. That's not necessarily realistic. And so I don't say that as a judgment. I say that in practice, to keep children, in the house indefinitely is not realistic. So that is just a way that we try to measure, what is rational versus what isn't. The anxiety or the fear in and of itself is not um, what we're judging as rational or irrational per se. It is, is it disproportionate, right, to what I need to do? So I can be nervous and worried that, oh, my children won't be safe in the streets, but I have to make it proportional to what we have to do. They have to be educated and they have to, play and have friends. And so how do I merge those two to come up with a more rational thought process and plan?
Awesome. Thank you for that great information. We have a couple of more questions. And
Sure.
so the next question that I have is, what do I need to tell my doctor if I feel like anxiety is an issue for me?
Mm. So I would record for yourself, right? Like, some of your day-to-day processes with your anxiety. And so we'll talk more about how anxiety manifests, some ways in which it manifests within us. It varies from person to person. Um, but but how it manifests is important. It's a significant part of how anxiety disorders are diagnosed. Um, and so, but when we'll get more into that. But I would certainly keep a log, of some of the things that you are perhaps excessively, worried about or concerned about, and how your anxiety sort of manifests within you, um, and what ways it limits you, right? And so, because the limits, if it does limit you, in some way. Again, we're now talking more about function, and how you're functioning in your life. So if you have, sort of these constant roadblocks, given your anxiety, then that's how we get to a greater understanding about how it's actually impacting your functioning. So once we get more to the manifestations of anxiety, you can certainly come back with an additional question, if that section doesn't give you some more data, for you to sort of think about for yourself and how your own anxiety sort of comes through.
Great, thank you. One more question, and this may also be lumped into what you just described, coming along in that manifestation standpoint. But the question is, are there underlying medical problems that could cause anxiety symptoms?
Oh, sure. So all things environment, all things, uh, physiological, medical, can induce anxiety. And again, that's why it's so prevalent because, if I am worried about, my health, if I'm worried about, the safety of my neighborhood, if I'm worried about losing my job, um, those both medical, physical, physiological, environmental, contextual pieces could cause and or increase my anxieties. And so therefore there's a correlation between, having cancer, right, being diagnosed with cancer, and also being very anxious, right. There is a significant correlation between, catching COVID, having COVID, and high anxiety, right? Because I have a number of fears, associated with it. So there's more of a correlation, and not necessarily a causal, effect, right? So, um, all persons with cancer, COVID, diabetes, high blood pressure don't necessarily have to, have difficulties with anxiety, but they certainly can, and it would be, reasonable if they did.
Awesome, awesome. That is just great information. And so we appreciate your insight. And before we move forward, one
Mhm.
last question and then we'll
Sure.
move on. This one has to do with, are there any free or low cost strategies for dealing with anxiety, particularly given the financial strain
Mhm.
COVID is placing on a number of families who may want to see someone but just don't have the ability to pay for a therapist at this time?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so we'll talk more about that, when we move forward. But yes, I think there's always a way, right, to figure out, how to seek, support. And so, I think there are, depending upon where you live, but there are always, clinicians who see persons on sliding scale. There are community mental health centers, but there is a way, right? To seek support. You don't have to sort of do this, alone. And again, whether we're talking about, the extent of anxiety at a disorder level or on a day-to-day level, there's always something that we should be doing, to take care of ourselves and to reduce, or resolve, our anxieties and our fears as much as possible.
Oh, awesome. So we look forward to some additional information. There are no further questions at this
Okay.
time.
All right. Very well. Okay. Um, so, how do we recognize our anxieties? Um, Again, anxiety is like any other feeling, it won't necessarily go away quietly. Um, and as it shouldn't, right? So, I like to treat anxiety, really like all other feelings, which is like a signal. It is telling me something, right? And so, you've been told many things before. Everything that you're told isn't imminent, right? Some of it isn't even important. but you're told, you are signaled, every day, all day, right? And so I like to treat anxiety like a smoke detector. It is signaling me. How I respond um, will vary, and it should. I should not call the fire department every time my smoke detector goes off. It's a bad idea, right? Because it's not always, of imminent threat. But I should be responsive, to my smoke detector, when it signals. And so it's really important that we do that. It's important that we recognize what is happening in our bodies and in our cognitions. Um, and when I say they won't go away quietly, I mean it. People report ruminating, constant thoughts, the same circle, the same loop, of any number of things that are anxiety inducing or worrisome or fearful to us. Um, and so we're trying to stop the ruminating because the ruminating in and of itself is not useful. It really has very little value, if it just continues on the same loop. So it's it's important for us to recognize our own individual manifestations of anxiety. It varies from person to person. Um, and so, that premise never gets old. I've worked with perhaps hundreds of people, and their expression, um, their manifestation of their own anxieties has been different. Um, and so it's important that you do your own sort of self-evaluative work, um, to honestly assess within yourself, when you are feeling anxious or nervous. I would also suggest that you not, judge your anxieties. That you should not judge them as silly or stupid or irrelevant, because that too doesn't help. You know, if remember, being a child or adolescent and starting school, and being anxious about your first day of school. It's a change, right? It's new. You've got some anxieties, you've got some worries. And sure, some of them may be irrational. You worry that, oh, I'll drop all of my books or my book bag and everybody's going to laugh at me. You may worry like, oh, I wear glasses and everybody's going to make fun of me. They may be multiple, but they're not silly because you feel them. And it's the same with regard to all feelings. They may not necessarily be factual, but they are real. um, they are felt, and they are important, and they should not be dismissed, you know or judged otherwise. So do your own self-evaluative work to understand how you typically or have historically responded to things that have made you anxious. So there are often um, physiological manifestations. Um, and so we really attach those physiological manifestations to that of panic. Um, and so panic disorder is, it falls within the anxiety disorders domain. But panic is really, this physiological response to what we perceive as threatening, um, or dangerous or fearful. And so the physiological symptoms, could be the pounding heart, stomach discomfort, your stomach sort of turning, sweaty palms, shortness of breath, um, hot flashes, feelings of shakiness. And so, this makes it ever so clear to us that we're fully connected here. Our cognitive aspects, the mind, body, and spirit are all collectively working together. Um, and so, I'm certain that everyone has had, some physiological manifestation of anxiety at some point in their life. Again, to get to the level of a panic disorder, you have to meet certain criteria, obviously, but these are when persons have had panic attacks where they've gone perhaps to the hospital or called EMT because they have felt like they were having a heart attack, right? Um, and they've gone to the emergency room and tests have been ran, and perhaps the medical doctor has said no, there's nothing medically wrong. Um, I've certainly heard patients, and clients that I've worked with over the years say, that, they were dismissed and sort of told, oh, it's probably just anxiety. Um, you know, I don't think of it as just anxiety. I think of it as anxiety, like, and so it's a thing. And I take it seriously. And I think we should take it seriously. It's not, something that just happens to some people. It happens to all of us. And so to have a big presentation, you can think of any number of things where a sense of anxiety could overcome you, a big presentation, a big change, um, a startled knock on the door. These things could induce physiological responses. Um, there are other manifestations that people report, a sense of expressions of impending doom or danger, right? Um, this urgent, sort of quick sense of like, this is going to be bad. I am so afraid that my that my husband was supposed to be home at 5 o'clock. He hasn't called, and it's now 9 p.m. And so we can jump fast forward to skipping all of the perhaps middle possibilities and jump to the end of I fear that it is death, that something terrible has happened. um, Sometimes people have a tendency to do that, to sort of skip all possibilities and get to the final fear of I fear that something terrible has happened. Um, Other manifestations are this fear of loss of control, again, death, physical or verbal expressions of worry, and fear. We have a number of examples of such where, and again, I hope after this, you will be more attentive to your loved ones. To your colleagues, because if you're attentive, and I recognize that I'm in this industry and so I'm a feelings and behaviors kind of gal, but you know if you're attentive, you know you can kind of see, and listen for, your family or colleagues expressions, or manifestations of the things that they're worried about, the things that they're anxious about. Again, particularly given, these COVID days, um, there is just more to be anxious and worried about. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't work to manage it, nonetheless. It just means that there's even more to sort of worry and fear. Um, so if you pay attention, you will see this in your friends and family, Um, and I only say pay attention, I don't say jump in, because, for all intents purposes, anxiety can be contagious, right? If you've, ever had someone close to you and you've recognized that they are nervous, right? That they are worried, you can easily merge feelings with them and worry for them, right? Um, if my husband has something pressing to do at work, and he seems to be moving slow, I feel in my own body this sense of like, well, when are you going to do it? When are you going to get started? Because it's making me anxious, that you've got this deadline. When are you going to do it? So that isn't an uncommon experience. Um, if you have that, I certainly want you to, work to keep it, at a manageable level, because we can, go overboard. If you've ever had, again, oh, I have this with older family members, my Nana and my grandmothers before they passed, they would worry for me, right? Um, and so it can be a heavy, additional aspect of anxiety that we're not only worried, and anxious about our own stuff, but about your stuff and about your stuff and everybody's stuff. Um, and so we just have to work to manage those, external anxieties as we would our own internal ones. And so, the last, this mentionable manifestation are, again, anytime our own functioning, is stifled, or we have put actual barriers, so that we don't move or go, those can be very, very clear manifestations of our anxieties and fears. And so, I've talked to many people over the years that didn't realize, that, their what felt to them like, excuses, but reasonable ones, in a different perspective, was very clearly seen as, you know, clear stifles and barriers, to moving, to going, to changing. And so it's an important part of our anxieties. Um, I have certainly felt that, and seen that happen over and over again, with people in abusive or terrible, difficult relationships. And so it isn't necessarily that, you know, this relationship is wonderful. In fact, it isn't. Um, it's perhaps familiar, like I'm used to it. I know what to expect. But the fear, right? The anxiety, the worry of, if I'm not here, what will I do? Where will I be? How will I make it? What will I do for money and companionship? And will I marry again? And so that becomes so anxiety inducing that I stay here. Um, so we have, hundreds of examples of that experience for people, and it's an important one to remember and think about for your own life. Um, I certainly think we were meant to grow, you know, and so, we need to grow in any number of ways. We need to be free. It is a human experience that is had by each of us, and so I'm constantly working with people, as they think about, their own growth, and not, in a necessarily big and tangible way, but in a way that is um, seeable and experienced and felt by them. So it's a way that our anxieties can really hold us back, and it's something that I like people to always think about and consider. So how do we reduce, and or resolve our anxieties? Um, I like to start with a plan. It's this quote. I love these quotes. Anxiety, it gives us something to do, but it does not necessarily take us anywhere. And so if you've had the experience of sort of, lying in bed, not being able to sleep because you're worried about something, you wake up the next morning and perhaps you're still worried about it, or maybe you move on to something else, but you come back to that same worry. It isn't actionable if we're just worrying. We can make things actionable. We can't do it all, right? We can't control all things, but we do have some say, in reducing our own anxieties and being clear on what I can do and what I cannot do. And if we can make that distinguishable list, I like to say I can control the hell out of what I can control, but that won't be everything. So start with a plan. No matter what your anxiety or your fear is, start with a plan. What can I do to reduce my anxiety, my fear, my worry, and problem solve the scenario or the situation? Without starting with a plan, without working to calm yourself, what tends to happen is that anxiety takes center stage, and we then can easily focus more on the anxiety than the problem itself. And that's how we find ourselves stuck. So calming yourself is a really critical, part of managing your own anxieties. And again, this goes for whether we're at, day to day or week to week anxiety or anxiety disorders. Um, and so, you know, deep breathing, I'm sure, is something that everybody has heard of and that we all do to some extent. Um, but it is really, really a critical piece to self regulating, um, really the more physiological symptoms of our anxieties. Because what we do is we teach the body that we're okay, right? And we teach the body in advance of the heavy anxiety that we are okay. And it helps significantly. Research has been astounding about how helpful deep breathing, is. We think of it, I've had adolescents who think of it as silly, like, oh, it's like, I breathe all the time, and it is true. We do until we don't, right? Until we have a fear that we won't. And so that happens when anxiety and or panic enter our bodies. And so something that we're used to doing all the time, that we do every day, that we have to do to live, seems forgettable when we're anxious, when we're nervous. And so if we can fall right into what we have practiced, which is consistent deep breathing, it makes it easier and it easily quells some of what is happening internally within our bodies. I think of it as just a critical part of my existence. I deep breathe multiple times a day. I do it as soon as I wake in the morning, as soon as my feet hit the ground, and before I eat lunch every day. And so, I try to do it, other times of the day, but those 2 points, I've labeled in an effort to make it consistent. And so as a result, when I am feeling physiological symptoms of anxiety inside of my body, it's just easier, to catch my breath and, regain a sense of inner control. If I'm shaky, if my heart is beating fast, if my stomach is turning, it's easier, to sort of regain that inner sense of control, which is really, really, really important for us as humans, to feel like we got it, like we're in control. And again, not of everything. Like I cannot control everything. I am not that good, but I can control many, many, many aspects within myself. And the greater sense of control that I feel, the easier it is for me to manage my own anxieties. Um, Smile, breathe again, and take your time. I certainly was told that, as a little girl from my grandmother, just smile, baby, and breathe. Things gonna be okay. Take your time, slow down. And it is a very important part of this. Like, if we take a minute, take a pause to regain ourselves, it makes a difference. Mindfulness is a practice that has been written about, and evidenced. There are numbers of techniques of mindfulness. For our purposes, I'll just tell you that mindfulness is really mostly about where our focus lies, and so if you can just think of, how big your room, your block, your city, your state, your country is, it's massive. And we are being stimulated all day, via all of our senses. And so, my kids love superheroes. And when they were little, they used to talk about like, oh, I would love to, have supersonic ears and hear everything that's happening. And I laughed and said, I don't want that, right? It would be overwhelming, right? And so we are meant to sort of temper information as it enters our senses so that we don't become overwhelmed. And so the practice of mindfulness is meant to do that. It's meant to help us sort of hone in and make things bigger or smaller as we deem necessary, as we see fit. And so where your focus lies is what you are most attentive to, as you should be. Um, and if the greater room or the greater big picture is too anxiety inducing, then make it smaller. And when you make it smaller, focus on the details. It's the details of it that will help absorb and allure you and ultimately calm you, because you're able to sort of slowly but surely block out, the other aspects. It's a temporary block, but it's an important one. And you do this already in some form or fashion, when you listen to music, and if you imagine the music and the lyrics, and you cognitively create, visual components to fit the music, or you think of yourself, when you first heard that song, you're so absorbed by it, you're not absorbed or worried or thinking about these other things. And so it isn't meant to be, a distraction, right? We are meant to mindfully also focus on hard things, necessary things, big decisions. Um, but if we can just make them smaller and more detailed, where they have our focus and our attention for whatever length of time, it's less overwhelming and less anxiety inducing when we can do that. So I would certainly, suggest that, all things mindfulness are, worth a read, I think. I've practiced mindfulness for 20 years. And when I started, I remember when I started graduate school, one of my beloved professors was like, you got to calm down. You're not going to make it. And I said, no, no, no. We got to do this. We got to do that. I got a paper. I got a presentation. I got to do. And so he really took me, by the hand and really was very supportive in helping to introduce the practice of mindfulness. And it has been very helpful in allowing me again to focus on what was before me and not everything all at once. Um, Obviously, other ways in which we cope is to consult trusted sources. Trusted sources is the critical part of that, because that doesn't mean everybody. There are people in our worlds who, for whatever reason, we would not find to be supportive or useful as we are trying to calm ourselves and make sense of things. And so, you deem who is a trusted source, as you see fit. But it's an important part of, we're not, we are communal people. We are connected. And we've learned that, I think, more so now than ever before with all things COVID, with, the limitations, in being with people that we love, know, and care for. But we can remain connected. And there are alternatives to, gathering, in the way that we are used to. And I certainly believe that we'll get there again. But in the interim, connecting is still possible, and it's still a very, very important, part of feeling well. It's what we need to do. So you connect with people that you trust. When you need to hear something that is kind and useful and calming, write, move, talk, all of those expressions help manage what is going on, for us cognitively in our heads and physiologically in our bodies. So it's something that, I think we can all do. It's very possible, and I say this because I work very, very hard to live it and model it for my family, and certainly for the persons that I work with. So with that being said, if there are additional questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lamar. That's been wonderful. Lots of great information. I can certainly say for myself that the breathing techniques is something that I learned younger in life, and I too use those on a regular basis because I just think it's very, very helpful. So that was a great tip to provide to the attendees. We do have a couple of more questions. So one of the questions is, if I recognize anxiety in a friend or a colleague that seems to be impacting that person's life, are there ways to offer support or resources that are not intrusive, or as you indicated, that don't put me in a position of taking on their anxiety as well?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's an important question, right? Like, we love, we like, we care for people, and we, by and large, want people to be well. And so we recognize all kinds of things, in people that we know and love. Um, and so, I would certainly start with being, thoughtful, and non-judgmental in what we give. And I know that can be difficult sometimes, but to the old adage of, putting myself in someone else's shoes is an important one, because it's applicable, right? Like, if you see someone who is struggling, to very simply ask them if they're okay, to call out what you perceive as anxiety. It isn't a bad word, right? And so, I am not offended, right? If someone who cares for me, who loves me, says, you seem anxious, are you okay? Right? So to call that out, and I know that that would vary depending upon the relationship and the dynamic, but to name it, right? You seem fidgety, are you okay? You seem worried, are you okay? Can I help in some way? The limitation again is to, offer the help, offer the support, in a tone that is supportive and kind and gentle. But it's okay to cut it off, right? It's, so it isn't, are you okay? Can I find you a therapist? Can I check your insurance for you and see what's covered? Like, that might not be, where you are within this relationship, or this dynamic. It could be, but, don't offer more than you can actually, afford to give or to do. Don't offer more than that, because if it induces increased anxiety or worry within you, then we've perhaps gone too far. I also forgot that there was the question about, resources and professional supports. So there are, obviously hundreds of thousands of websites that offer information, about anxiety, about stress, about depression. But in terms of professional support, you know obviously your insurance provider, if you're working and if you have private insurance, Medicare and Medicaid have upped, their mental health services given COVID. So they are allowing and providing things that they had never done before: telehealth services, phone services, etc. Certainly your church, or clergy, if you are involved in such, your own personal supports, but also the consistency of one trusted source, right? One sort of weekly, bi-weekly check-in with one person that that you care for, and where you can just sort of air some of your concerns. I am worried sick. I can't believe this. Those sort of outlets consistently can be very, very helpful. And then lastly, I use the site Psychology Today. And they have filters for sliding scale services, where there are clinicians who see patients for what they can afford, and it makes all the difference in the world.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. One last question before we wrap up, and that's, are there other lifestyle changes that can help someone feel better when they're experiencing anxiety? You mentioned the breathing, but are there other lifestyle types of changes that you would recommend?
Sure. I mean, practices of yoga, are very, very helpful, if one is committed to, such physicalities, walking, fresh air, movement is really a critical part, like, to just sort of move, in your own space, can help sort of release some of the physiological tension that is happening. Um, Writing, the journal writing, audio videos of just emoting and expressing your own, anxieties or concerns or depressions or et cetera, because we're just trying to get it out. Like, we just need to get it out. So whatever form of that is helpful, to you as an individual is allowed, right, to express it. We worry about behaviors. Like, I don't want people to, violently express their emotions, right? So we do it in a conducive and supportive and helpful manner to ourselves. So therefore, all other things are really on the table. But setting some time, for oneself, again, minutes, an hour, whatever you can, that is specific to the treatment of me. It just helps us, sort of plan and manage, our anxieties. I write something every day. If there is something that is beyond my control, I still, to this, I've done this for 20 years. I will get a piece of paper and draw a line in the middle. And on the left, it is what can I control? And on the right, it is what I cannot. And I focus on what I can control, and I create steps, with what I can control. And as my grandmother says to me, I stay in my lane. I try to focus on those things and not on the things that I can't. The things that you can't are the worries. Oh, I wish the kids could go back to school. I can't believe the kids can't. My kids need to go back to school. I don't have sole control of that. So I can express it. I can talk about it. I can hope for it. I can contribute, to the solution, but I cannot change it all by myself.
Great, great. Thank you so much for that. We are certainly very appreciative of your time, Dr. Lamar, today. I certainly have learned some information that I feel like I will take away as nuggets to be able to help when those worrisome situations come up. I also would just like to thank you for your time and your expertise and just really some practical information. I feel like you have provided kind of the explanation of anxiety and what it is and what to do on really a very simplified level that even I could understand. Not greatly, greatly appreciate that. And again, on behalf of our president, C.K. Hoffler, and the National Bar Association, both the Health Law Section and the COVID-19 Task Force, we know that this information will be valuable to our members. And so for those who are attending but maybe came in late, there is a recording and this will be advertised just to let you know. But we appreciate your time and effort today and look forward to being able to work with you in the future.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.